Now, when investing offshore, it's very important to understand the tax implications of your investment. And to look at this in a bit more detail, let's take an example of a particular client. Let's assume a client invested in 2010 an amount of 5 million rand, and let's assume that their offshore investment was denominated in dollars. Now, at that point in time, in 2010, must have been lovely, the rand to dollar exchange rate was 775. That means that their 5 million would have bought them 662,000 US dollars. And let's assume for this example, they went into the MSCI All World Index. We'll assume they went passive, and we'll also ignore fees for this particular illustration. Now, if we look back into 2020, Jan, 10 years later, this investment, due to rand weakening and great phenomenal growth offshore, would have grown from 5 million all the way to 24.4 million. In dollar terms, now at an exchange rate of 14.94, you can see the rand has basically weakened from 775 to 14.94 over this period. It means that the investment of 24.4 million is worth, in dollar terms, $1.636 million. Now the question is, what is the tax implications of the different structures that they could have gone into? And let's assume for our example, their tax rate is 45%. They are in the maximum tax bracket. What is the implication of the different investment structures? Now let's consider a structure that many people use when investing for the first time offshore. Let's look at the feeder fund option as our first option. Now, in the feeder fund option, if they were to disinvest in Jan 2020, they would take this 24.4 million rand that they've invested, and now their base cost for capital gains tax purposes would be the 5 million rand in ZAR that they initially invested, which means that their gain is 19.4 million rand. That is their gain for this scenario. So we take that 19.4, we times that by 40%, the inclusion rate, we times that by their tax rate, over here, very important, 45%, and that basically means that their effective tax rate is 18% if I take the 40% times 45, and that means the tax that they are going to pay if they were to disinvest from the feeder fund is close to 3.5 million. It's 3.499 million rand is the tax implication if they were to go for the feeder fund option. The second option that we'll look at now is, what if they went directly offshore? They didn't go into a wrapper, but they went directly offshore into hard currency. Now again, what would the tax implication be? Now in this example again, the value, if they were to draw today in ZAR, is 24.4 million, but now the base cost, very important, here we had a base cost. If I go back to my earlier example, the base cost was 5 million rand that we used. Now the base cost is not the original amount that was invested in ZAR, it's the original amount that was invested in dollars. So that means that in this particular example, we are now going to take the 662,000 and look at the exchange rate in 2020, the day that they are actually disinvesting over here. Now that means that their base cost now in this particular example is not 5 million, their actual base cost is now 9.89 million. And that, how do we get to that? We basically take the 662,000 and we take today's exchange rate. So the rand weakening doesn't actually hurt you. Actually, it helps you because now you have a larger base cost compared to the 5 million, which means you have less of a capital gain. So now the capital gain in this particular scenario is not 19.4, the capital gain is 14.554 million. Now again, we take this times our 40% inclusion rate, and we again times it by 45%. So again, I could have just taken a net effective rate of 18%, and that gives us a total tax liability in the direct option, because I'm investing into direct hard currency, of 2,619 million. You can see a lot less than the 3.4, 2.619 million. And then what about the third option? What if they went into the OMI structure? Not only are they investing now in hard currency, they are also benefiting from a lower tax rate of 18%. Now, again, in this particular example, the current value that we'll use if they were to disinvest is 24.4 million. Now again, the base cost is not 5 million. We use the base cost in hard currency now, again in this example, which is a 662 times the 1494, which means their base cost is 9.89 million. So again, we have a capital gain in this scenario of 14,554 million. But now very important, because they are in the OMI structure, here they now benefit because now it's not just so we take the 14,554 and we times it, we don't just times it by 40% times 45, now we are timesing that particular amount by a 30% tax rate, not 45, we take that down to 30%, which means that their net effective tax rate here, we could have said, is now 12% as opposed to the 18% in scenario 1 and 2, which means, most importantly, their total tax liability in this particular scenario is 1,746 million. So, feeder fund option, 3.5 million. Go direct, don't utilize the OMI structure and benefit from the lower tax rate, 2.6 million. And in this scenario, with a client in the 45% tax bracket, the OMI structure comes in at half what the feeder fund came in at, 1.746 million. And that is the benefit of making sure your clients are in the correct structure when investing offshore. And that is the value of good advice.